The smell reached them long before the shoreline did. Not smoke. Not burning timber. Not damp coal soaked by endless rain. Something else. Something warm. Something rich. The wind carried the scent of slow-cooked meat across the harbor, mixing with salt water and the sharp smell of rust clinging to the steel hull. Below deck, dozens of exhausted women lifted their heads almost at the same time. Empty stomachs responded before their minds could. No one spoke. They simply breathed. For many of them, it was the first time in months that the air smelled like someone was preparing a real meal instead of merely surviving another day. Elsa Hoffman sat quietly against the cold steel wall, her coat pulled tightly around her shoulders. Hidden beneath the fabric rested a small wooden serving spoon, worn smooth after years of use. Her father had carved it by hand when she was a little girl. It had stirred countless pots of soup inside their family restaurant in Hamburg, where laughter had once echoed between wooden tables and steaming windows. She ran her thumb across its familiar grooves. It was the only piece of home she still possessed. At 25, Elsa had never imagined crossing an ocean as a prisoner. Before the war, she knew kitchens, not camps. She knew recipes written in fading notebooks, not military schedules. She knew the comforting rhythm of chopping onions beside her father while her mother welcomed hungry customers through the front door. Their restaurant had never been famous. It didn't need to be. It was simply home. Every Sunday afternoon, her father would stir a large pot of cabbage soup with that same wooden spoon and smile. People return for food, he always said. But they remember how you made them feel. Those words had stayed with Elsa far longer than the restaurant itself. She often wondered if the building was still standing. If the windows still overlooked the narrow cobbled street. If anyone remembered the family who once cooked there. Or if everything had disappeared beneath bricks and ash. The ship slowed. Chains rattled overhead. Heavy footsteps echoed across the deck. Orders were shouted in English. The women looked at one another with quiet uncertainty. Where were they? What kind of camp awaited them? Would anyone ever return home? Or would this strange country become the final chapter of lives they no longer recognized? No one had answers. Only silence. And the strange smell of food drifting across the water. Elsa tightened her grip around the wooden spoon. She had crossed an ocean carrying a memory. She had no idea she was about to discover a meal that would forever change what home meant. Morning fog clung to the harbor as the women stepped carefully onto solid ground. Everything felt unfamiliar. Wide roads stretched beyond the docks. Large warehouses lined the waterfront. American trucks rolled past carrying crates stamped with words Elsa couldn't read. Nothing looked broken. Nothing smelled of smoke. The buildings stood straight. Windows were whole. People hurried to work carrying lunch pails as though the world had never fallen apart. Elsa stopped walking for a moment. How could ordinary life continue while entire neighborhoods across Europe had vanished? A young woman beside her whispered softly, "It looks untouched." Elsa nodded without speaking. She wasn't jealous. She was confused. The contrast felt impossible to understand. American soldiers directed the women toward waiting transport trucks. Their voices remained calm, firm, professional. No one shouted. No rifles were raised. One officer removed his cap before addressing the group through an interpreter. "My name is Captain James Ashford. You will receive shelter, medical care, and food. You are expected to follow camp regulations." He paused. "You are prisoners." Another pause. "But you are also human beings." The words settled heavily over the group. Some believed them. Others refused to. Years of fear had taught them that kindness often came with conditions. Trust was not something easily rebuilt. Especially after everything the war had demanded. The drive to the camp passed endless green fields. Red bonds. White fences. Farmhouses surrounded by fruit trees. Elsa watched cows grazing peacefully beside narrow streams. She had almost forgotten what peace looked like. When the trucks finally entered the camp, the women expected high fences, shouting guards, and constant fear. Instead, they found rows of clean wooden barracks standing beneath tall oak trees. Laundry fluttered gently between poles. A gardener trimmed flower beds near the administration building. Somewhere nearby, church bells rang. The sound caught Elsa completely by surprise. For a brief moment she closed her eyes. The bells reminded her of Sunday mornings back home. Of polished shoes. Fresh bread. Her mother's apron dusted with flour. She opened her eyes quickly. Memories had become dangerous. Inside the barracks, each woman received blankets, soap, towels, and a small storage locker. Elsa carefully placed her wooden spoon inside before stopping herself. She hesitated, then removed it again. Instead of locking it away, she slipped it into her apron pocket. Some things needed to stay close. That evening, the women gathered quietly around long dining tables. Metal trays waited in neat rows. Steam rose from enormous serving pots. Elsa instinctively watched the kitchen staff. Years of working in restaurants had trained her eyes before her thoughts. She noticed the careful organization. Fresh vegetables stacked in wooden crates. Large sacks of potatoes. Barrels marked with English writing. Clean cutting boards. Sharp knives. No one wasted movement. Every cook knew exactly where to stand. Someone cared deeply about this kitchen. She found herself wondering who. A cook carrying bread noticed her staring. He smiled politely. She looked away immediately. Old habits survived even when certainty did not. Dinner was simple. Soup. Bread. Butter. Enough to satisfy hunger without extravagance. Yet what surprised Elsa most was abundance. Nobody counted slices. Nobody measured portions with fearful precision. There was enough for everyone. She ate slowly. Not because she wasn't hungry. Because she had forgotten what it felt like to stop worrying that the food might disappear. That night's sleep came slowly. Rain tapped softly against the roof. Women whispered about families. About missing brothers. About uncertain futures. Elsa reached into her pocket and wrapped her fingers around the wooden spoon. She could almost hear her father's voice. A good meal begins long before anyone sits at the table. The following morning, assignments were announced. Laundry. Cleaning. Garden work. Storage. Kitchen. Each name carried a different future. Elsa waited quietly. Captain Ashford looked down at the list. Elsa Hoffman. She stepped forward. Kitchen duty. For the first time since leaving Germany, her heartbeat quickened for a reason that wasn't fear. She followed an older American non-commissioned officer toward a large brick kitchen near the dining hall. The man introduced himself simply. Sergeant Harold Novak. He unlocked the heavy wooden door. Warm air rushed out. Steam rolled across the entrance. The rich aromas of onions, carrots, herbs, fresh bread, and slowly simmering meat filled the room. Elsa stood frozen. Large copper kettles bubbled gently over industrial stoves. Rows of vegetables covered preparation tables. Fresh loaves cooled beside open windows. American cooks moved with quiet confidence, laughing occasionally as they worked. For a moment, she wasn't standing inside a prison camp. She was back inside her father's restaurant. Novak noticed the expression on her face. "You've worked in kitchens before." It wasn't a question. Elsa nodded. "My family's restaurant." "What kind?" "Traditional German meals." He studied her for a moment, then handed her a clean white apron. "Good. We'll see what you can teach us." Elsa accepted the apron with trembling hands. She had expected punishment. Instead, she had been given purpose. She had expected suspicion. Instead, she had been invited into a kitchen. What she did not yet know was that one unfamiliar American meal, corned beef and cabbage, would challenge everything she believed about food, memory, and the meaning of home. And before long, she would find herself reaching for a second helping, then a third. The first morning inside the kitchen began long before sunrise. Outside, darkness still covered the camp. Frost clung to the wooden fences. A thin layer of mist drifted across the gravel paths as the distant whistle of a freight train echoed through the valley. Inside the kitchen, everything was already alive. Steam curled from enormous copper kettles. Knives struck wooden cutting boards in steady rhythm. Fresh coffee filled the room with a rich aroma Elsa had almost forgotten existed. Someone laughed near the ovens. Someone else hummed a tune she didn't recognize. For a brief moment, it sounded less like a prison camp, and more like a family preparing breakfast together. Elsa stood quietly near the entrance wearing the white apron Sergeant Novak had given her the day before. She wasn't sure where to begin. Back home, she had known every corner of her father's restaurant. Every shelf. Every recipe. Every sound. Here, everything felt unfamiliar. Sergeant Novak noticed her hesitation. He walked over carrying 2 large sacks of potatoes and placed them gently on a work table. "Start here." Elsa looked at the mountain of potatoes. "There are hundreds." Novak shrugged. "Then you'll be busy." It wasn't a joke. But somehow she smiled anyway. For nearly an hour she peeled potatoes in silence. The work calmed her. The steady scrape of the knife reminded her of evenings spent beside her father preparing Sunday dinners. Neither of them had spoken much while working. They never needed to. Good kitchens understood quiet. Eventually another voice interrupted her thoughts. "You peel very fast." Elsa looked up. The young American cook smiled awkwardly. "My name is Thomas Carter." He couldn't have been older than 23. His apron was already covered with flour. A wooden pencil rested behind one ear. "You worked in restaurants?" Elsa nodded. "My family owned one." Thomas grinned. "That explains it." He pointed toward a large kettle. "I'm still slower than you." Elsa almost laughed. Almost. Instead, she simply returned to peeling potatoes. Thomas didn't seem offended by her silence. Some people understood that conversation wasn't always necessary. Throughout the morning, Elsa watched how the American kitchen functioned. Nothing happened by accident. Every cook had responsibilities. One prepared vegetables. Another baked bread. Someone monitored the ovens. Others cleaned continuously while meals were still being prepared. Back home, shortages had forced everyone to improvise. Here, organization created abundance. Sergeant Novak believed every movement mattered. When someone carried a heavy pot across the room, he quietly corrected their route. When a knife was returned to the wrong shelf, he noticed immediately. When a young helper wasted several carrots while peeling them too deeply, Novak picked one up. He didn't scold him. He simply held the carrot in one hand. Then spoke calmly. "Food isn't endless. Respect every ingredient." The young man nodded. Elsa listened carefully. Her father had said nearly the same thing years earlier. Respect the food. And the people who worked to grow it. Perhaps good kitchens spoke the same language everywhere. Even across oceans. By the end of the week, Elsa had become part of the routine. Morning vegetables. Midday soup. Fresh bread. Evening cleanup. She still spoke very little English. But she no longer felt completely lost. One afternoon, Corporal Daniel Morales entered the kitchen carrying several wooden crates. As usual, he arrived smiling. "I've brought today's mystery." Thomas laughed. "What is it this time?" Morales dramatically removed the cloth covering the crates. "Green cabbages. Dozens of them. Round. Heavy. Perfectly fresh." Thomas groaned. "Oh no. Cabbage again." Morales shrugged. "Farmer donated them." Novak looked toward Elsa. "You know cabbage?" She almost smiled. "In Germany. We know cabbage very well." For the first time, Novak looked genuinely interested. "What would you cook?" Elsa hesitated. Then answered quietly. "Braised cabbage. Potato dumplings. Sometimes smoked sausage." Thomas blinked. "That sounds much better than what we make." Morales laughed. "Everything sounds better than what you make." Even Novak smiled. The conversation lasted only seconds. Yet something important had changed. For the first time, people weren't looking at Elsa as a prisoner. They were looking at her as a cook. That evening Novak handed her a small notebook. The cover was worn from years of use. Inside were handwritten recipes, measurements, cooking times, ingredient lists, everything written in English. Novak placed it on the table. "Learn." Elsa looked surprised. "I can't read most of this." "You will." He pointed toward the first page. "Kitchen workers must know more than recipes. They must understand people." She frowned slightly. "I don't understand." Novak nodded. "You will." Over the following weeks, Thomas became her unofficial English teacher. Every afternoon, he pointed toward ingredients. Salt, pepper, flour, butter, cabbage. Elsa repeated every word carefully. Sometimes she pronounced them correctly. Sometimes not. Thomas never laughed. Instead, he simply repeated the word again. Patiently. One ingredient at a time. Soon Elsa began answering simple questions. Need more onions? Yes. Where knife? On table. The sentences were awkward. Broken. But each day became a little easier. Language, she realized, resembled cooking. Nobody mastered it after one attempt. Mistakes were simply part of the recipe. Then came her first real challenge. One rainy morning, Novak assigned Elsa responsibility for preparing lunch vegetables. Alone. Hundreds of servings. She worked confidently. Chopping onions, carrots, potatoes, cabbage. Everything seemed perfect until Thomas lifted one of the stockpots. His face changed immediately. "It tastes different." Novak walked over. He sampled the broth. Silence. Elsa felt her stomach tighten. "What happened?" Novak asked. She tasted it herself. Then understood instantly. The soup was far too salty. She had confused two nearly identical containers. One held seasoning. The other held coarse preserving salt. Without realizing it, she had ruined an entire kettle. Enough food for hundreds of people. The kitchen fell silent. Elsa stared into the steaming pot. All she could think about was waste. Food wasted. Time wasted. Trust wasted. She whispered quietly, "I'm sorry." Nobody answered immediately. Finally Novak reached for a ladle. He stirred the soup thoughtfully, then looked toward Thomas. "More potatoes. More water. More cabbage." Thomas nodded. Morales immediately disappeared into storage. Within minutes everyone began working together. Nobody blamed Elsa. Nobody shouted. Nobody humiliated her. Instead, they solved the problem. Nearly an hour later Novak tasted the soup again. He nodded once. "Better." Elsa looked confused. "You aren't angry?" Novak wiped the spoon clean. "I've ruined bigger meals." Thomas laughed. "So have I." Morales raised his hand. "I once burned 600 biscuits." Thomas smiled. That was impressive. For the first time since arriving in America, Elsa laughed without forcing herself. Not because the mistake was funny. Because nobody had made her carry it alone. That evening she sat outside the barracks watching the sunset spread across the fields. The wooden spoon rested in her hands. She remembered her father dropping an entire pot of stew when she was 12. She had cried. Certain customers would leave hungry. Her father simply smiled. Then started cooking again. Good kitchens, he had told her, are not remembered because nothing goes wrong. They are remembered because people care enough to make things right. Elsa looked toward the glowing windows of the American kitchen. For weeks she had believed she was merely surviving. Now, she wondered if she was beginning to belong. And without realizing it, the meal that would change everything was already simmering inside the largest kettle in the kitchen. The kitchen smelled different the next morning. Not because of fresh bread. Not because of coffee. Something heavier drifted slowly through the room. Warm spices, pepper, bay leaves, and the unmistakable aroma of meat simmering for hours. Elsa paused beside the doorway. She had never smelled anything quite like it. It reminded her of Sunday dinners. Yet it was unfamiliar, comforting, and strange at the same time. Large iron kettles rested over low flames. Steam escaped in slow clouds. Inside them floated thick slices of beef, wedges of cabbage, carrots, onions, and potatoes. The broth shimmered beneath the morning light. Sergeant Novak noticed Elsa watching. "You've never seen corned beef before." She shook her head. "No." He lifted one of the heavy lids. "This is one of America's favorite comfort meals." Elsa leaned closer. The meat looked different from anything she remembered. It wasn't roasted. It wasn't smoked. It had been cured slowly before cooking. The cabbage had softened until it almost melted into the broth. She frowned. "You cook the cabbage with the meat?" Novak nodded. "The cabbage absorbs the flavor." Elsa looked doubtful. "In Germany, we usually keep them separate." Thomas laughed from across the room. "So did I the first time. You'll understand after one bite." Elsa wasn't convinced. Back home, traditions mattered. Every family had recipes passed from one generation to the next. Changing them almost felt disrespectful. Yet curiosity quietly replaced skepticism. Throughout the morning she helped prepare hundreds of portions. She carefully sliced carrots, placed potatoes into serving trays, lifted softened cabbage from the kettles. The meat surprised her most. Instead of falling apart into dry pieces, it remained tender, almost buttery. Novak handed her a carving knife. "Try." Elsa sliced carefully. The blade moved through the meat with almost no resistance. She looked surprised. "So soft." Novak smiled. "Patience. Good food takes time." Those words sounded strangely familiar. Her father used to say nearly the same thing while stirring soup late into the evening. Good meals could never be hurried. Neither could healing. By noon the dining hall filled with people. American workers. military personnel, kitchen staff, the women from the barracks. Everyone received the same meal. No separate tables. No special portions. Only one long line. Elsa carried her tray toward an empty seat beside Greta. Greta examined the cabbage suspiciously. "It looks overcooked," Elsa whispered. "I thought the same." They exchanged uncertain smiles. Finally Greta picked up her fork. "You first." Elsa sighed. Then cut a small piece of beef. A little cabbage. One potato. She tasted everything together. The room disappeared. The cabbage wasn't bitter. It had become sweet. The broth carried gentle spices she couldn't name. The beef almost dissolved before she finished chewing. Warmth spread through her chest. Not because the food was hot. Because something about the meal felt familiar. Safe. Across the table Greta stared. "Well." Elsa slowly took another bite. Then another. Finally she smiled. "It's..." She searched for the English word Thomas had taught her. "Wonderful." Greta immediately tasted hers. A moment later both women laughed quietly. Thomas walked past carrying another tray. "I told you." Elsa shook her head. "I've never eaten cabbage like this." Thomas grinned. "Most people haven't." For several days the meal became the favorite topic inside the barracks. Some women tried guessing the ingredients. Others wondered how the beef stayed so tender. Greta insisted the Americans must have secret spices. Nobody guessed the answer. One afternoon Novak noticed Elsa studying the empty kettle after lunch. "What are you looking for?" She answered honestly. "The recipe." Novak folded his arms. "Why?" "So I can understand it." He reached into a nearby drawer, removed several stained recipe cards, and handed one to her. The paper had softened from years of use. Grease stains covered the corners. Measurements filled both sides. Everything written neatly in English. Elsa stared at it. "I still can't read all of this." Thomas appeared carrying a pencil. "I'll help." For the next hour they translated every line together. Salt. Peppercorns. Bay leaves. Mustard seeds. Slow simmer. Rest before slicing. Elsa copied each word carefully into a notebook. Not because she intended to replace her father's recipes. Because she wanted to understand another family's traditions. She realized something unexpected. Food carried history. Every recipe told a story about the people who created it. German bread. French soup. Italian pasta. American corned beef. None of them were simply meals. They were memories served on plates. That evening Greta found Elsa writing beside the barracks window. "What are you doing?" "Learning." Greta looked at the notebook. "American recipes." Elsa nodded. Greta laughed softly. "If your father could see you now." Elsa smiled. "I think he'd ask for seconds." The following week the camp prepared for a community gathering. Families from a nearby town would visit. Children would tour the gardens. Volunteers planned to serve lunch outdoors. Novak gathered everyone together. "We're expecting more than 300 guests." Thomas groaned dramatically. "Only 300? Morales laughed. "I was hoping for 5. Even Elsa smiled. Novak continued. "We'll prepare corned beef and cabbage." Then he looked directly at Elsa. "And this time, you'll help lead." The room became quiet. Elsa blinked. "Me? You know the recipe now." "But my English." Novak interrupted gently. "People don't follow leaders because they speak perfectly. They follow people who care." The words stayed with her all afternoon. For weeks she had believed she was only learning recipes. Now she understood something larger. Trust had quietly entered her life one meal at a time. The morning of the gathering arrived bright and cool. White clouds drifted across a clear blue sky. Children's laughter echoed outside the camp. Long wooden tables stretched across the grass. Fresh bread cooled beneath linen cloths. Large kettles simmered gently beside the serving area. Elsa stood beside Novak wearing a freshly pressed apron. Her hands trembled slightly. Not from fear. From responsibility. Novak noticed. Nervous. A little. He handed her the carved serving spoon used for stirring the kettles. It reminded Elsa instantly of the wooden spoon hidden inside her pocket. One carved by her father. One worn smooth by countless meals. She smiled. 2 kitchens. 2 countries. 1 purpose. As the first families approached the serving line, Novak nodded toward her. "Go ahead." Elsa lifted the ladle, served the first plate, then the second, then the third. A little boy looked up at her. "Thank you." The words were simple, almost ordinary, yet they carried more weight than he could possibly know. Elsa answered carefully, "You're welcome." The pronunciation wasn't perfect. The smile was. Late that afternoon, after the last table had been cleared and the final kettle washed clean, Elsa remained alone inside the quiet kitchen. She reached into her apron pocket, removed her father's wooden spoon, and placed it gently beside the American serving spoon on the work table. For several silent moments she simply looked at them. Different wood, different hands, different countries, yet both had stirred meals meant to comfort strangers. She realized then that recipes could cross oceans. Kindness could too. What she did not yet know was that before long another letter from Germany would arrive. And with it, the hardest decision of her life. The seasons changed almost unnoticed. Summer gave way to autumn. Autumn surrendered to winter. The trees surrounding the camp stood bare beneath gray skies, their branches reaching silently toward clouds heavy with snow. Inside the kitchen, however, life continued. Bread still rose before dawn. Soup still simmered through the afternoon. The familiar scent of corned beef and cabbage drifted through the hallways every Friday, becoming as dependable as the sunrise itself. For Elsa, the kitchen no longer felt like a place of assignment. It had become a place of belonging. She spoke more English now. Not perfectly, but confidently enough to greet suppliers, answer questions, and teach newly assigned workers where ingredients belonged. Thomas often joked that she corrected his cooking more than Sergeant Novak did. Morales claimed she had become the real boss of the kitchen. Even Novak occasionally stepped back and allowed Elsa to organize an entire day's preparations herself. Without realizing it, she had become exactly what her father once was. Someone others quietly depended upon. Then one cold December morning, Captain Ashford entered the kitchen carrying a single envelope. The room immediately fell silent. Everyone knew what letters could bring. Hope, relief, or heartbreak. He walked directly toward Elsa. "I believe this is yours." She recognized neither the handwriting nor the return address. A strange uneasiness settled over her. She thanked him softly and slipped the letter into her apron pocket. She couldn't bring herself to open it. Not yet. Not while soup still needed stirring. Not while bread still waited to be sliced. Work had become her refuge. If she kept moving, perhaps the words inside the envelope could not change her life. But by evening there were no more excuses. She sat alone inside the nearly empty barracks. Snow drifted quietly beyond the window. With trembling hands, she unfolded the letter. It had been written by Frau Ingrid Keller, the woman who had once lived across the street from her family's restaurant. The message was painfully short. "Dear Elsa, your father spoke of you until his final days. He believed you would someday cook again. He wanted you to know that the restaurant never reopened. There simply wasn't enough left. He passed away peacefully last spring. Before he died, he placed your wooden spoon in my hands. He told me that if you ever returned, you must keep cooking. Not because people need food, because people need hope. With deepest sympathy." The letter slipped from Elsa's hands. She stared across the room without seeing it. The restaurant was gone. Her father was gone. The future she had imagined since childhood had disappeared forever. For the first time since arriving in America, she questioned everything. Who was she now? A German? A prisoner? A cook? Someone without a country? Or someone without a home? The following morning she reported to the kitchen. But she barely spoke. She prepared vegetables without looking up. She forgot measurements she knew by heart. Twice she nearly burned the bread. Thomas noticed first. "You haven't smiled all morning." She forced one. "I'm tired." He knew she wasn't. Sergeant Novak quietly approached after lunch. He placed the folded letter on the work table. "I read it only because Captain Ashford asked whether you needed time away." Elsa nodded silently. "I don't know what to do." Novak looked toward the empty dining hall. "When I came home after the last war," he said quietly, "I thought the only thing I'd lost was friends." He paused. "It took years to realize I'd also lost the person I thought I would become." Elsa listened carefully. "I wanted to reopen my father's restaurant. Now there's nothing left. Novak gently picked up the carved wooden spoon resting beside her cutting board. He turned it slowly in his hands. This spoon wasn't carved for one restaurant. It was carved for every meal you would ever prepare. Elsa looked at him. But my family is gone. Novak nodded. So mine. Silence filled the room. Then he spoke the words she would remember for the rest of her life. Homes disappear. People don't. The love they teach us travels farther than any ocean. That evening Elsa walked alone into the quiet kitchen. She lit a single lamp, opened the pantry, removed cabbage, potatoes, carrots, fresh beef, bay leaves, peppercorns. She wasn't following the American recipe, nor her father's. She was creating something entirely new. She stirred the kettle with her father's wooden spoon. Hours passed unnoticed. The aroma slowly filled the building. Rich, warm, comforting. When Thomas arrived before sunrise, he stopped in the doorway. What are you making? Elsa smiled softly. I don't know. Thomas laughed. It smells wonderful. It tastes like Germany. She stirred gently. And America. That afternoon everyone gathered for lunch. American soldiers, kitchen workers, German women. Nobody realized Elsa had changed the recipe slightly. She had added herbs her father always used. A touch more onion, less salt, longer cooking time. The first bite surprised everyone. Morales looked up immediately. What did you do? Thomas took another spoonful. I'm not sure. It's different. Novak smiled quietly. It's hers. No one asked whether it was German or American. It no longer mattered. It had become something new. Just like Elsa herself. Months later, announcements arrived. Several women would return to Germany. Others had opportunities to remain in America through sponsorship programs. Captain Ashford found Elsa outside the kitchen garden. A family-owned restaurant in Pennsylvania needs an experienced cook. They've asked specifically for someone who understands large kitchens. Elsa remained silent. The decision felt impossible. Germany held her memories. America held her future. That night she placed her father's wooden spoon beside his final letter. She thought about empty streets in Hamburg. Then about children's laughter echoing through the American dining hall. She finally understood something. Home wasn't always where your story began. Sometimes, it was where your story found its purpose. She accepted the position. Years passed. Elsa became head cook, then partner. Eventually she opened a small restaurant of her own. Above the entrance hung a modest wooden sign. Hoffman's Table in Hamburg. Then about children's laughter echoing through the American dining hall. She finally understood something. Home wasn't always where your story began. Sometimes, it was where your story found its purpose. She accepted the position. Years passed. Elsa became head cook, then partner. Eventually she opened a small restaurant of her own. Above the entrance hung a modest wooden sign. Hoffman's Table. The menu changed with the seasons. German potato soup, fresh bread, apple cake, American stews, and every Friday, corned beef and cabbage. Customers often asked why the meal appeared every week without fail. Elsa simply smiled. It's a recipe that reminded me strangers can become family. Few knew the deeper story. Even fewer noticed the old wooden spoon hanging inside a glass frame near the entrance. Children often asked why such an ordinary spoon deserved a place of honor. Elsa always gave the same answer. Some recipes feed people. This one fed my heart. Decades later, an elderly Elsa stood quietly in her restaurant before opening for the evening. Outside, snow drifted gently onto the sidewalk. Inside, warm light reflected from polished wooden tables. The familiar scent of simmering cabbage filled the air. She removed the carved wooden spoon from its frame one final time, ran her fingers along the smooth handle, then stirred the evening's first kettle herself. Just as her father once had. War had taken away her homeland. It had taken away her family. It had taken away the restaurant where her story first began. But it had not taken away the lessons carried inside a simple wooden spoon. Some journeys do not end where we expect. Sometimes they lead us to a table we never imagined sitting at. Elsa Hoffman crossed an ocean believing she had lost her place in the world. Instead, she discovered that the warmest welcome sometimes arrives in the form of an unfamiliar meal. And every Friday, when the first pot of corned beef and cabbage began to simmer, she remembered The menu changed with the seasons. German potato soup, fresh bread, apple cake, American stews, and every Friday, corned beef and cabbage. Customers often asked why the meal appeared every week without fail. Elsa simply smiled. It's a recipe that reminded me strangers can become family. Few knew the deeper story. Even fewer noticed the old wooden spoon hanging inside a glass frame near the entrance. Children often asked why such an ordinary spoon deserved a place of honor. Elsa always gave the same answer. Some recipes feed people. This one fed my heart. Decades later, an elderly Elsa stood quietly in her restaurant before opening for the evening. Outside, snow drifted gently onto the sidewalk. Inside, warm light reflected from polished wooden tables. The familiar scent of simmering cabbage filled the air. He turned it slowly in his hands. This spoon wasn't carved for one restaurant. It was carved for every meal you would ever prepare. Elsa looked at him. But my family is gone. Novak nodded. So mine. Silence filled the room. Then he spoke the words she would remember for the rest of her life. Homes disappear. People don't. The love they teach us travels farther than any ocean. That evening Elsa walked alone into the quiet kitchen. She lit a single lamp, opened the pantry, removed cabbage, potatoes, carrots, fresh beef, bay leaves, peppercorns. She wasn't following the American recipe, nor her father's. She was creating something entirely new. She stirred the kettle with her father's wooden spoon. Hours passed unnoticed. The aroma slowly filled the building. Rich, warm, comforting. When Thomas arrived before sunrise, he stopped in the doorway. What are you making? Elsa smiled softly. I don't know. Thomas laughed. It smells wonderful. It tastes like Germany. She stirred gently. And America. That afternoon, everyone gathered for lunch. American soldiers, kitchen workers, German women. Nobody realized Elsa had changed the recipe slightly. She had added herbs her father always used. A touch more onion, less salt, longer cooking time. The first bite surprised everyone. Morales looked up immediately. What did you do? Thomas took another spoonful. I'm not sure. It's different. Novak smiled quietly. It's hers. No one asked whether it was German or American. It no longer mattered. It had become something new. Just like Elsa herself. Months later, announcements arrived. Several women would return to Germany. Others had opportunities to remain in America through sponsorship programs. Captain Ashford found Elsa outside the kitchen garden. A family-owned restaurant in Pennsylvania needs an experienced cook. They've asked specifically for someone who understands large kitchens. Elsa remained silent. The decision felt impossible. Germany held her memories. America held her future. That night she placed her father's wooden spoon beside his final letter. She thought about empty streets,